All right, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to begin our workshop. Tonight's workshop is on our equity policy, and I'm going to hand it over to Superintendent Patana to get us started.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us for the workshop. Yesterday, we remembered those who fought and died to preserve the freedoms that we enjoy as a country. This time-honored tradition represents our collective commitment as Americans to honor the supreme sacrifice that it represents to give one's life for the values that we hold so dear. This past weekend, we also paused to remember the one-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd, which sparked a movement to recognize that those freedoms are not distributed equally among us. Today, we're also marking the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, one of the darkest chapters in the history of this country, and one that I, as many of you here today, didn't learn about until very recently because it has been hidden from our view in textbooks. Our commitment to remember the sacrifices of so many to preserve and extend American values is manifested by our focus on equity as a school district and our vow to make those inequities visible to our students in what we teach and in how we conduct ourselves in every aspect of our educational enterprise. Over the past year, the Curriculum Committee, working with Assistant Superintendent Malia Nally and Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Barrett Wilkinson, has developed a new policy to reflect the board's enduring commitment to identifying and removing barriers to equitable access and opportunity for students, staff, and community. The school board acts through the selection of the superintendent, through the adoption of the budget, and through policy. In the past couple of years, as Chair Figdor mentioned earlier, the school board has fully embraced its role in policymaking as a lever for equity and change. The gender expansive policy, the harassment discrimination policy, the discipline policies that you approved are not symbolic. They provide a statement of intent and a vehicle for a more just and equitable school educational opportunities for all of our students. The equity policy provides an overarching framework to organize all of that work and all of the policy work that remains to be done. So I'm looking forward to the workshop today and the discussion now and at the June 15th board meeting. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Malia and Barrett to lead the workshop.
Great, thank you, Superintendent. Erin, do you mind presenting the slides? To get us started. Thank you. Great. So good evening, everybody. I am thrilled to present this new policy to you this evening. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Member Bondo, who is the board's sponsor and leader for the development of this policy, who's going to kick us off by sharing her why behind this policy. From there, we'll hear from two members of our policy work group, Lynn Nguyen, a student from Deering High School, who's also graduating tomorrow. So it's especially unbelievable and incredible that she's spending this evening with us to share her why about the policy, as well as Kate Kessler, who's a teacher from LISAT. Barrett and I will then step you through our process and the components of the policy itself, just to help you kind of digest what's there. And then we'll bookend this descriptive overview by hearing from two more work group members about their whys. Nikki, who's a student from Casco Bay High School, and Pamela, our AP from Lyman Moore Middle School. At the end, we'll take questions, and at that time, the other curriculum committee members who worked on this policy over the past year, Member Burke and Member Rodriguez, can also chime in to help answer questions and share their perspective. So before we get into some of the description, Ms. Bondo, I think I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Manny. I just, I am so thrilled, like you just mentioned, and emotion, because of the process that we went through almost, during the pandemic. It was not that easy, but I think Barrett and yourself and the community engagement, the youth engagement. So it was just a whole large community, plus, our curriculum community. So why I sponsored that, it was from my heart, because I have two whys that I just want to share today. Because for me, is that's going to be the foundation for all the process. I mean, the process to reform practices, the process to reform policies, the process, but under an equity lens to support the high achievement and high quality learning. Because when I look at now, when I just reflect back, when I see all our teachers who are retired, you see how many years they've been spending in our district. I mean, we have a good system. We have a system, but that system needs to be improved. Improved, I mean, to make a fairness on some of the opportunities, and we need to be able to present for all our students to thrive. So this is one of my whys. And the other one is that it's going to help teachers, administrators, staff, to have ending goals. I mean, where they are going when they are, investing to our students during all our professional development, during all our curriculum. What's their goals? I mean, they should have an ending goal, and the ending goal is that exactly what we are providing is that equity that they need to have as an ending goal, because that's exactly the way they're going to be able to build the right strategies to make sure that each student can have a good opportunities to reach out their best potential. And also, are we going to be able to create a school and a classroom, a better culture where each student can really see themselves involved and be welcome? So those are my two whys. Then I was really pleased to join the team and to build under the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bondo. Next, we're going to hear from Lynn, the student from Deering High School, similar to Ms. Bondo, share just a little bit about her why connected to this policy and her involvement with creating it.
Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so first and foremost, I would just like to thank Barrett for inviting me to this meeting. I think just having the conversation of how do we make our schools become how do we have more equitable policies within schools is a very important conversation to begin with. I think for me, since I'm graduating tomorrow, I think that when I'm leaving Deering, I'm not leaving with just all of the academics and all the knowledge that I've gained from my classes, but I'm also leaving with all of the experiences that my classmates have shared with me. I think, especially at Deering, being such a diverse community, all my peers come from all parts of the world and they have so many stories to tell. And it really saddens me when I see that, there are still a lot of inequity when it comes to technology access, especially with this pandemic, and that we see many holes within equity, that, students don't even have access to technology in order to go to that Zoom meeting to get the education they need, and all these disparities. And I think that with the pandemic, we're able to realize that we have to start looking for policies through an equity lens. And so I've been working with this policy group for a while now with Barrett. And I think just having this conversation, even though we had a very smaller group, I think just having the conversation in the first place is very important for the future, in which we look for policies through an equity lens and start to see that, okay, maybe this issue is not problematic for some students, but we have to take a look at the wider scheme and the bigger picture and see, what are the students that we're prioritizing and what student we need. And so I think that with this, I'm very excited to see the future of this policy. I think it's great that we have it in writing in order to ensure that we have accountability, and that, in the future, when we go through making newer policies, we take a look at, the equity process of it. And, I'm as it has been said, I'm going to be graduating tomorrow, and I'm just very excited that I'm going to be leaving Deering knowing that, we're heading towards the right direction, that we're going to continue and strive to create an environment where any student, regardless of the access resources they have, regardless of where they live, regardless of, their socioeconomic status, that they're able to have the education and the support they need. And so I just want to thank you all for coming today to just talk about this conversation in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for, once again, your super articulate and insightful comments. And once again, congratulations on tomorrow. We're so happy you were able to join us for this. And then finally, before we get into some of the nitty gritty, I want to invite Kate Kessler, who's a teacher at Lyseth Elementary, to share just a bit about her why.
Thank you. Happy to be here. And Lynn, congratulations, a little bit early. I had a lot of thoughts about this, and so I wrote them out. So bear with me. I'm going to read while you're here. I'll try to not click off and disappear. In 2018, I was lucky to join the Equity Leaders Cohort, a group formed of, by, and for Portland Public Schools staff to address issues of inequity within our school system. The Equity Leaders Cohort includes representation from each of our schools and programs, and I've been fortunate to learn from and work with my colleagues from across the district on equity issues for the past 3 years. Participating with this group has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my job outside of my classroom itself. It has provided me a direct way to engage with important issues such as race and racism in education. I first read Peggy McIntosh's article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, as a college student in the late 1990s. Now well known, yet still disputed, the article called out 26 aspects of daily life that white people can often take for granted. For example, number 1, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. The article knocked me over because it called out the differences and experiences I had witnessed among my family and friends of different racial backgrounds growing up, and helped me think about our experiences in a new way. I entered the field of education as an assistant teacher in a charter school in New York City in 2000, with this new awareness, but without a way to address it. And since then, I've taught in New York, Massachusetts, and here in Maine. But until joining the Equity Leaders Cohort, I did not have a direct way integral to my role as a teacher to address issues like racism in education systematically. Now, I really can't imagine working for a school system that isn't addressing these issues head on. So as part of my comments tonight, I would just like to take a minute to express my appreciation and admiration for the leadership here, all of you at Portland Public Schools, for committing to this work. So this is why I was interested in spending this past year helping to draft this policy and be part of this work group with my amazing colleagues. Without a policy that states our commitment to educational equity, our school system is without a clear set of principles and a clear course of action for addressing some of the most ingrained historical inequities that exist. The policy is valuable to us as a community. It defines equity itself, bringing shared language to all the stakeholders of Portland Public Schools, and providing us with direction and a lens for addressing inequities wherever we discover them. During the process, I wondered whether instead of writing a new policy, we should be combing through our existing policies and revising them with an equity lens. But as I've reflected more on the process of writing the policy and on the end result, the written policy as it is being proposed tonight, I believe there is inherent value to the policy itself. It clearly and publicly states the institution of Portland Public Schools acknowledges historical inequities and is actively working to root out those that still exist within our institution. Most importantly, this is being done with a lens towards supporting each of our students' paths to success as individuals in the complex context of 21st century America. Policy adoption is a starting point. Implementation, adherence, and action must follow. My hope is that this policy will make an impact by increasing our community's understanding of the underlying issues faced by so many of our students, and that its articulation of these issues will help us work together to address them for the betterment of us all: students, families, staff, administrators, board, and community members. I believe the policy you're reading tonight is a critical step along the path of our ongoing commitment to redressing the causes of educational inequity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And thanks again, Lynn and Mickey, for sharing a little bit about of your why as it pertains to this policy. And again, thank you so much to all of you for your contributions to bring it to fruition. So I'm going to pass it to Barrett, and he's going to step us through just a little bit about how we develop the process. Folks have spoken to the process itself as something that's been important to us, and then we'll break it down so hopefully you all can understand it a bit more. So Barrett, I think you're out there somewhere.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm very excited to be at this moment in this policy development. As you can see from this slide, it's been a minute in the making. We initiated this conversation with the curriculum committee actually pre-pandemic, right before the pandemic. And so things were necessarily on hold. But we took the summer to regroup and then really relaunched after regrounding amongst the committee to move this forward through the fall. We created a work group. We began engaging with stakeholders to really brainstorm about what this could look like, what we wanted it to look like. And then the work group began drafting and working together to get towards the version you have before you today. So just so you can see it's, like all good things take time, I guess. And I can go to the next slide, Erin. So you can see who is part of this. From the beginning, we were able to really think about both the people who had expertise and insight around equity and equity literacy in our district, but also who represented a diversity of identities and lived experiences, as well as the roles they hold in our district. And so you can see like the staff represent, a lot of different types of positions. They come from elementary, middle, high school. We have central office, parent community specialists represented, all of that. We, of course, had Mickey leading this work from the board level. We had 2 parents who engaged at different points with the work group, and then we had students. And the student work group happened both with the full work group and in addition to really support their participation. And then we had some additional students that we connected with, particularly as the policy was near completion. You can go to the next slide. Key to that student work group I was mentioning was collaboration with Muntaha Muhammad from Portland Empowered. She co-facilitated the student work group with me and really helped keep that going throughout the year. So I'm deeply grateful for that partnership and collaboration. But we had stakeholders engaged really from the beginning. And so initially this was a lot about, brainstorming what this could be, what we wanted this to be. And then as the year went on, it became responding to specific aspects of the policy or definitions, or then the full draft later. So you can see some of the groups that we specifically engaged, existing entities, and then some feedback sessions we put out there just as open sessions for more people to engage in the policy. So, some good opportunities that from learning from pandemic about like how we can easily outreach to people virtually and get more feedback. You can go to the next slide, Erin. The board curriculum committee and then the work group came up with the stakeholder engagement questions that we used initially, just so you can kind of see what we were gathering information on and how that process kind of got started. And just so you could kind of have some context for that, this is how we got into that. So asking different groups of people, like, what are our strengths and successes? What are our gaps? What is equity? How do you define it? All of those things were really central. And you can go to the next slide. So I'll start us off with a little bit of the overview of the policy, and then Malia will continue it. But, a many-page document summarized on one slide is essentially this, which is the purpose, scope, definitions, and then the policy expectations. And so we'll just talk you through that a little bit for purposes of orientation. So it felt like we couldn't start this work without naming the purpose and rationale of why we're doing this. So the purpose and scope statement is something we spent a lot of time on and that people really appreciated. as part of this policy. There's a slightly updated version for the purpose and scope with minor revisions based on legal counsel consultation, but it's really the place where we kind of name why we're doing this. But one of the most important goals of this policy was to define equity for our district, and that was actually probably the primary thing that that we wanted to do, because we recognize that while we've had equity as a strategic priority, it's become increasingly clear that there isn't necessarily a shared definition of what equity is. And in order to deepen our work, we really need that. We need that shared definition. And so as the policy work moved forward, it became clear that there were some other definitions that were really central to being able to outline this and what we wanted to do. And so those are the 5 definitions that are named up front in the policy. And they are also ones that are used in our work and in our district. And so it feels really reflective of like the work that's happening, but also moving forward. Next slide. In the first section is the staff and capacity building, which is all about how we support staff to make this work actionable. So first and foremost, ensuring that staff professional learning is grounded in equity literacy, driven by research, best practice, and informed by those who have experienced marginalization in our system. A key piece of this is that we will have orientation for staff and students as it relates to this policy. And the students had some really great ideas about the implementation of this and the need for good implementation around explaining the policy. So that comes in there. Also, as it relates to staff evaluation, that Portland Public Schools educators and staff are responsible for bringing an equity lens to their work, and that the evaluation needs to incorporate that. And then finally, certainly a very big bucket of work related to the hiring, recruitment, and advancement. So we know there is great work to do to improve hiring, recruitment, development, and retention of staff, because we want to have equity literate and linguistically diverse teachers, administrators, and staff who represent, the racially diverse and cultures and identities of the student and community populations we serve. This also outlines the ongoing use of the Equity Hiring Toolkit to guide our hiring process. This was launched initially in 2019. And so by kind of naming it here, we'll continue that as something to use as a continual coaching and support throughout our system. And then finally, thinking about the retention. We have incredible staff, and we want to build their capacity to ensure we get to continue to hire people who hold equity and racial equity essential to their work. And so we want to support pathways for staff and for BIPOC staff to advance within the system. So that's the first sections I'll cover, and I'm going to pass it back to Malia.
Thank you, Barrett. So I'll step you through curriculum instruction next. Given the disparate outcomes that we see, we know we have to make changes to our curriculum and instruction, since we do believe that all students can rise to high expectations. So our aim is to use an equity-based curriculum, which for us speaks to both what we teach, so the content, and how we teach it, which we call the pedagogy or teacher practices. Beyond the what and the how, this section of the policy speaks to our responsibility to ensure all students get what they need to thrive academically. So this section of the policy names 6 specific actions we can take. First, there's an acknowledgement that all teachers are responsible for the learning of all students. This means that classroom and content teachers are responsible for ensuring their instruction is accessible to English language learners, students with disabilities, and any other student. This is in line with our Allow plan and special ed focus on collaboration, so that classroom and content teachers get the professional support in order to do this effectively. In a nutshell, this moves us away from the notion that ELL students are the responsibility of ELL teachers only, or students with disabilities are the responsibility of special ed teachers only, and towards a mindset where we are all responsible for all of the students in front of us. The next concept speaks to taking an assets-based view of students. Our students gave us feedback that this term wasn't clear, so in the policy language, we speak to the idea of focusing on students' strengths and personal agency. The expectation here is that we move away from the notion of deficits-based thinking about students, where we focus on what they lack or what they don't know or gaps. The next two aspects of this section speak to ensuring our curricula are representative of people from diverse backgrounds and reflective of the diverse student population we have in Portland. They speak to our responsibility to ensure students are able to learn about themselves and others. This is something our students have given us feedback on over and over again. We consistently hear them tell us that our curriculum is not reflective of multiple perspectives and that many students do not see themselves in what we teach or what we read. By asserting this expectation here, we aim to put more accountability on ourselves to students have been giving us. Next, we assert that students should be given opportunities to learn about uncomfortable historic truths, including systemic racism or cultural genocide. In order to ensure students are able to think critically about the world around them, we're committed to ensuring they are learning a true accounting of history. And then finally, this section names the importance of holding all students to high expectations while providing the appropriate supports to ensure all students can meet the high expectations. The research is clear that a teacher's expectations of their students play a huge role in determining what a student achieves. And so this policy aims to assert a clear expectation that we must hold all students to high expectations so that they're prepared and empowered for their next goal. Next, Erin, thank you. The next section speaks to how equity in the school environment means that for any student or staff entering our schools, they'll experience an environment that is inclusive, safe, welcoming, and where they feel valued as a member of the community. This section acknowledges that when the school environment is isolating, hostile, or physically inaccessible, people will not learn or be engaged. This section has two components. The first speaks to the physical space and making sure that it's accessible to people with varying abilities and disabilities. This simply reinforces what we already are required to do to make our buildings physically accessible, but it can also be interpreted more broadly in terms of how the physical space does and does not create a sense of inclusivity and a welcoming atmosphere. The other aspect speaks to climate and culture and names the importance of ensuring the experience at school is inclusive, welcoming, and emotionally safe for students and staff. The two recent reports we've reviewed, Social Media Report and the Educators of Color Report, both provide feedback from our students and BIPOC staff that our school culture and climate is not consistently inclusive and welcoming, and that we have significant work to do to live up to this expectation. Next, we move into what we refer to as a series of implementation strategies, the first of which is land acknowledgements. It is thanks to Bridget Neptune's recommendation that we integrated the expectation around land acknowledgements into the policy directly. Many of you have heard about Bridget before. She is a Passamaquoddy citizen, a parent of students in our district, and our primary consultant on the development of the Wabanaki Studies curriculum. Bridget also served as a member of the Equity Policy Work Group. This section names the importance of using land acknowledgements in various settings, such as formal public gatherings or as a part of visual displays in buildings and spaces that are part of PPS. You have all grown accustomed to hearing the superintendent do this at the start of every board meeting. For those of you less familiar with the concept of land acknowledgements, they are a way of showing respect and honoring the indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. They serve as a way for people to insert awareness of indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. They are viewed as a very basic step towards resisting erasure of indigenous histories and inviting the truth. Finally, our policy language speaks to how land acknowledgements are connected to broader curriculum instruction and inclusive school environment efforts. This connection point was part of the feedback that came out most strongly from our student stakeholder groups. They wanted to make sure that we tied this practice into a bigger expectation around curriculum and school environment as well. Next section focuses on resource allocation. This section quite simply sets an expectation that the way we allocate our resources is aligned with our stated goal around advancing equity. Specifically, it requires a superintendent to build an annual budget that clearly articulates how it advances equity. And it requires all school-based activities and opportunities to be accessible to all students so that a student is not excluded from accessing opportunities based on not being able to afford it. The language here goes on to name that families should not have to have an added burden to prove a level of need in order to access financial support, except when required by state or federal law. And the idea here is to not make it especially difficult or uncomfortable for a student or family to access financial support to participate in any school-sponsored activities. This next section emphasizes the essential nature of community engagement as it pertains to walking the walk with our equity work. It names that our communication strategy must facilitate interactions where students and families feel welcomed, empowered, and treated as authentic partners in the educational process. It includes 4 key actions that are intended to support this commitment to community engagement. They are making sure we have systems and structures in place that uplift and amplify student voice, ensuring that we have language translation and interpretation for written and oral communication. This is really a cross-reference to policies IHBEC and IHBECR, but we wanted to name this commitment explicitly in the context of this section. Third, forming partnerships with groups outside the district who have a demonstrated commitment to supporting racial equity. And fourth, collaborating with organizations that can help us hear the voices of families and all stakeholders in the community to help inform our decision-making and resource allocation. And then the final 2 implementation sections speak more directly to accountability. First, the policy includes an expectation around data utilization. Specifically, there's an expectation to consistently disaggregate data by race, economic background, language, and special education status at a minimum in order to truly understand our outcomes. This section calls on the district to establish clear goals and measures that directly address closing opportunity gaps and addressing disparities. It requires the district to do ongoing database reflection on student achievement, discipline, student engagement, family engagement, so that we can monitor outcomes and understand root causes for any gaps. And it speaks to the fact that the data we collect should give us insight into progress as it pertains to redressing inequities. It calls out the importance of qualitative data in addition to quantitative data. This is another place where we heard strong student feedback, asking that we collect information about the student experience in class and in school-related activities, and that we collect it in ways that are safe for students to share their true experiences. And then finally, this section speaks to the practice of conducting periodic equity audits. An equity audit is used as a process to evaluate policies, programs, and practices through an equity lens. Finally, the last section speaks to the compliance with this policy. In every stakeholder group conversation we had, people wanted to know how we were being held accountable for implementation of the ideas named in this policy. This section calls on the superintendent to report at least annually on progress and outcomes as it pertains to the expectations in the policy. This includes annual goal setting and ongoing progress monitoring. It also includes the expectation that the policy is considered when developing or revising other policies. This policy is unique in that it names a set of concrete expectations, and it's intended as a lens by which to view all other policies. And finally, the section names the importance of reviewing this policy itself annually to monitor progress and to consider if it requires updating as we move deeper into implementation. It speaks to the importance of making sure all students and staff are aware of the policy. Barrett referenced this earlier. And the student stakeholder group spoke clearly and strongly to the importance of making sure that we make this policy accessible to students, both in how we break it down and in how we ensure all students get acclimated to what's contained within it. We are eager to start working on these types of policy rollout steps once it's formally adopted by the Board of Education. So we are going to close with 2 more whys and then are excited to jump into your questions. Aaron, do you want to play Nikki's short video? Nikki is a student from Casco Bay. He's been a loyal member of the work group, has attended almost every meeting with the full group and with students. And he taped a very short video, just giving a little bit of his perspective on the policy development. So Aaron, if you want to play that, that would be great.
I think that this equity policy work group is a huge step in making the schools more equitable, and it reflects on the past and present while also laying groundwork for the future. I really hope that other schools in Maine can use this as an example. I think looking forward, collaboration and engagement is a huge thing that was brought up in this policy. I hope that staff, students, and the school board and the community can all work together to create our a more equitable school system. I think as a student, it was important to engage in this work group just to lend a student perspective and help in any way I can.
Thank you, Nikki, for bringing your voice, even though you weren't able to be physically present with us tonight. And then I think we're going to end with Pamela, who, there you are, is our assistant principal at Lyman Moore. And she's also been a member of the work group and is going to share her final why.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you. So when I was asked to share my why, the reason why I was devoted to doing the work to bring this policy to existence, my initial thoughts really were, well, look around and you'll see millions of reasons for why. So really, it's so evident if you spend time in our schools that not all students are receiving the same academic experiences. They're just not. If you sit in meetings and witness conversations and interactions, it's quite clear that not all voices are valued. And if you look at our staff and the various roles that they occupy within our schools, it doesn't take very long to start to see that there's certain groups, certain values are placed on certain groups, and it's really apparent that there's a perception for each group's level of competency, right? So you see that certain people are ed techs, and you've got certain people are the ones supporting the ELL students and so on. So not to name them, I think if you've been in our schools, you're sort of aware of these differences, and that says a lot. And then when you sit in, when I sit in, or if you were to sit in equity trainings and hear debates about how we can offer just and fair opportunities to our students and to staff, it becomes clear that there's not a common understanding of what equity really means. There's not a clear definition for it, which really hinders moving the work forward. And just want to share, so since I started working in this profession, became an educator, I have honestly worked tirelessly to try and ensure that every student gets the best education possible, or at the very least, gets the same education as the peers around them. And so the students who tend to be shortchanged are the ones, sadly, whose parents trust us to do our jobs, right? To provide the supports and opportunities that are necessary for their child to succeed. And oftentimes, and not only academically, but also socially and emotionally. And these students are predominantly our students of color and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So in my role as an educator and as administrator, and definitely in the teacher role, I really had to use the law to advocate for students. And I had to have a loud voice, a voice and refuse to be silenced in order to bring equity to the forefront and provide our students what they need. And really to do this, to be equipped to take on this task, that meant attending state as well as national conferences in order to become aware of the rights of students. And I have colleagues, there are other colleagues who have similarly risen up for our students and staff. And the fact that we have to fight and raise our voices to be heard lets you know that there's a problem. There's a problem there. And then there are other colleagues who really have left the profession, right? Because they got weary of fighting the good fight and self-care became essential. So when I was asked to join in this work, to team up and work on this equity policy, this policy that would drive all other policies, right? And bring this work to the forefront, I emphatically said yes. I was very excited to do this work. So here before you, as Barrett and Malia stated, is a policy really that defines equity. As I said, that's one of the weaknesses in the district is now this policy sort of gives us that ground floor. So we have this common understanding of what equity means in order to move the work forward. It hones in on the need of staff and capacity building and really shines light on the need for equitable curriculum and instruction for all students, not just some, but all students. And it emphasizes the importance of culture and climate, which directly, right, in my work with with schools and with PBIS directly impacts the well-being of the entire community, right? Academically, social, emotionally, all of these things. And the last piece in the policy, which speaks to resource allocation, that portion really will diminish the differences and experiences between the haves and the have-nots. And that's going to be transformational. So I'm really excited to see how that changes things. So just wanted to briefly share. So as we neared the end of this work, one of the last questions that was posed was, should we make this policy shorter? Is it too long, right? And I remember, and I quickly said, no, please don't. Please don't. Let's not shorten the policy at the cost of eliminating some very important aspects that our schools need, right? So this is going to be like my, I don't know, for lack of a better word, like sort of my weapon or ammunition that I'll have to support me in this work that I've been doing moving forward, and colleagues and others, right, in various roles doing this work will be able to use this. So I really sincerely hope that as you read this policy, that you'll join me in celebrating its creation. I was in tears listening to Lynn share, because I know what the experiences for students have been and for staff members. So I really hope you join me in celebrating the creation of this policy. And it should have happened a long time ago is the reality, but better late than ever. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. And thank you again to Nikki and Pamela and Lynn and Mickey and Kate for sharing your personal why behind the information that is written in the policy and that Barrett and I tried to step you all through. So that's the end of the presentation portion. And so since we're workshop, I think there's just an opportunity for folks to ask questions so that you understand what's in here in order to help inform your perspective and vote for the next meeting.
Thank you so much to Malia and to the whole team for this really stellar presentation and for sharing your personal motivations and insights as well. It was really brought the presentation to life in a pretty unique way, so thank you. Are there questions from the board? Ms. Trevorrow.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to just kind of share my support for the policy since we're in workshop. This is excellent work, and it's equity work is probably the greatest, most imperative issue of our time and place. And I think that, having this policy gives us some accountability and some guidance on where we're going. So I really am grateful to everybody who brought this forward for the work that's been going on since March of last year. So just wanted to express appreciation and look forward to supporting it next week or 2 weeks from now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Trevorrow. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, but I want to start at one of the last comments that Pamela made. Sorry that I'm jumping right into the questions and not acknowledging the great work. I'll get to that. Pamela, when you said that there were some considerations or some questions about shortening the policy, were there any specific things that were mentioned that could potentially be either edited or shortened? Or I'm just wondering, was it where that came from, the request to shorten it?
So that, and Millian Barrett, correct me here if I'm wrong. So that came from when we were looking at the different focus groups that, looked at the policy and gave feedback. That came from the administrators group. That was a question they had, whether or not the policy was too long and whether or not it'd be too much for people to read and really digest and if it should be shortened.
Yeah, and I would just add on, I heard it from some different people in the context, even in the work group, and then the student group sometimes brought up less shortening and more streamlining. And I think the feedback, some of the theme was in the spirit of trying to get people to sort of internalize it in a more bite-sized way. But like Pamela said, I think ultimately we wanted it to be clear and explicit about what we meant. So when we think about rollout and implementation, we have a lot of ideas about how to do that to help people digest it. But anyway, I just want to share that was one of the things behind where we heard that feedback, though. I'm sure there's other intentions behind that feedback as well.
I think the other little piece is just about like what goes in the policy versus what is about implementation. And that was like a constant calibration, especially as we neared the end.
Yeah, and I think I can see how that would become part of the conversation, particularly as we were going through it today. And, you know, as part of the curriculum committee, I've had the pleasure of seeing a few of the more recent iterations of this. But as we were going through it, there was this component of it that really facilitates kind of it being accompanying the Portland Promise equity goal, right? Like there is a lot of implementation and there's a lot of follow-up. Kind of like the shortcomings of the Portland Promise equity goal, right? Like this takes us a step further, which I think was initially the part of the intent, as we explained. Great, I appreciate that, the explanation about that, add some context. Another question, you know, as when we talked about one of the purposes in relation to how professional development is carried out, I want to, so, you know, I am one of the folks who might be, and I'll describe myself as, I find this work needs to be accomplished with a sense of urgency. I find frustration in the pace of progress in this work, but I'm also very aware of the need to do this work carefully and thoroughly. And I also am aware of that we are all evolving in this work differently. I appreciate when Kate spoke about, you know, her experience in the work groups, how it helped her tie some things together, that she was pretty much, she had the information, but maybe there were a few extra pieces that needed to be put together. So again, we're all evolving. But given that the sense of urgency that I feel with this work, I can correlate it to, you know, just, you know, the damage, the danger that we're literally putting children through when we're excluding them of opportunities. So I guess what I'm getting at, where do those two things reconcile themselves? Where do we, you know, bring the urgency of, like, there really should be no tolerance for some of the behavior, some of the, I mean, we had a great example over the last week, and Chair Victor mentioned it in her remarks tonight. You know, there's signs that were put up throughout the city advocating for people to vote against the budget. And in the sign, it said something like equity for all students, which is exactly what we're trying to get this community to understand with a policy like this. That's not only is that a wrong use of the word equity, it's a dangerous way to leverage that word. So how do we reconcile the urgency with which this work needs to be done and the thoroughness and the pace that a policy like this forces us to take? I'm sorry, I didn't direct that to anyone in particular.
I mean, so how do we reconcile the tension between urgency and what's the other side of that again? Roberto, I apologize.
Well, the damage that we're doing to children every day when we put up with the people who are quote unquote slow to get it.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are always talking about not pacing for privilege.
Yeah.
And as powerful and necessary as this policy is, you know, it forces us to be slow.
Yeah.
So I just wanted us to speak about how we reconcile the urgency with which this work needs to be done with, and how it really cannot be done fast. And in the process of it not being done fast, there's still children suffering.
Can I ask what makes you say that this policy forces us to go slow?
Because this work is slow, as you know, Superintendent.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I don't think that the policy is doing that. I think this work is slow. Right.
And I guess, and I'm trying to not add this, and I started saying that the personal development piece is what I wanted to speak about. I guess I'm concerned with the lack. I don't think I need to reframe it. I'm concerned with the people that don't pick up the urgency with which this work needs to be approached with, and the fact that we cannot force that urgency. So I understand, Superintendent, that the policy is not what causes that slow progress. But I do want us, in the process of this workshop and for the purpose of this policy, to speak about reconciling those two things, because we are talking about pacing for privilege. Yes, we are. I'm sorry, Superintendent, I see you nodding, but we are. We are because we put up with staff who knowingly are causing damage to students. We put up with staff who are publicly advocating for things that we know are dangerous. And we put up with staff who in professional developments we know are either rolling their eyes, not paying attention, or counting minutes waiting to get out of the room because they don't value the work that we're putting in front of them. So how do we
oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I guess I have a comment. I mean, I think that's, and I know you know that's a huge topic. It's not like a singular answer, but I do want to make one comment as it pertains to the policy. And I think one of your examples in terms of professional development is a place where I'll focus, which is that so much of the conversation that came behind this policy was a sense of urgency around having more accountability. And so as an example, you talked about professional development. We have offered professional development. You know, we talk about the fact that this isn't just an opt-in PD, but this is PD that's done across the system or at the building level. But we have heard stories that there are particular people that miss all the equity PDs, or that they're, you know, that if you miss, there's no kind of, people don't know that, or you might not make it up. So in professional development, we try to speak very directly to the fact that it's an expectation that all staff are expected to take part in the common professional development work. So I know that language in and of itself isn't sort of a game changer, you know, in and of itself, but I think what we've heard from equity leaders, from staff, from administrators is that support with having tools that hold all of us accountable to actually taking action is something that's needed. And so I'm not saying that the policy itself is complete for addressing what you're talking to in terms of the tension around urgency, but I think it's a very intentional and deliberate step to provide a new level of shared understanding and accountability that has not existed before, and that is intended to create greater urgency and more accountability around following through with action. So I know that's just a perspective as it pertains to how I see this policy supporting the urgency that I hear you describing.
I appreciate that context. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Mr. Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, the team, Mel and Kate and Molly, all of you. Thank you so much. The slide that we talked about accountability, we mentioned student feedback and their engagement and sharing their experience. And since we have shortage of scholars of color, I think a student contribution would be specifically by BOC student would be very important for any policies to be changed. So what are other ways that we can provide to them so they can contribute to the work of creating equity, and how can we empower their voice and give them more platform where they can share their voices? For instance, if they present to us as a board, just suggestion, and that we can take consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. And was that mostly a comment, or did you want us to respond as well?
If there are other ways that you guys come up with other than sharing the feedback, I would like to know. Yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, you talked about that in the section where we talk about, hearing voice and having additional qualitative data. I think that the policy language, Barrett mentioned this, that just consistently a tension we were grappling with was what's policy versus what's the actual action plan that would result from the policy. So I think a little bit of what I'm hearing in your question is, we speak to the fact that we need to do these things, and you all will hold us accountable for sharing what we're doing. So I think, as we try to implement this policy, there'll be a whole host of different things we do to share and amplify voice and get more qualitative perspective from students. And so I think that we don't name all the specific actions here, but that the policy charges us with doing that, and then gives you all the authority to make sure to check in on and to hear from us that we're taking that action. Does that make sense? I know it doesn't give you like a set of concrete examples, but I think as it pertains to what we're trying to accomplish with the policy, it gives you, just like you did right there, the language and the shared expectation that we need to then be able to have those action steps as a result of that policy expectation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and Barrett too, or others, Mickey, if there's anything I missed, chime in.
Thank you, Mr. Youssef. Ms. Russell-Better.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to acknowledge the huge work you guys have all put into this, and like this is big. This is really big work. Just as far as the language and definition, and of what we want to be seen in our buildings, and the why. So I think Malia was starting to answer some of what I was thinking to ask, but I guess just to get a little more specific, I was just trying to picture, after the step of the policy, and maybe I'm just curious, being a new school board member too, like when doing policy changes recently, sort of for that next step of action plan and implementation, accountability, would you see, and when you were mentioning about the tools, like when you were mentioning, what tools would be used for us to see, that in our buildings we have action steps to implement, right? To know that these policies are actually being put into place. Would you picture that there would be like further committee work to then be doing the action plan? Just kind of, I'm trying to picture what those next steps in implementation, to look at that, what that might look like.
I don't picture committee work the way we did it to develop the policy being the way we would go about action planning, because we have established routines and structures for developing annual goals and plans with our schools and within our departments. So our intention would be to take this lens, and so much of this isn't, this is all, so much of this is already kind of what we're striving for, right? So much of what's named here is already embedded in the goals and the plans that we have. It's just putting it together and making it a policy that, creates that kind of visibility, expectation, alignment, and accountability. But I would expect the planning would happen in the context of how we set goals and set priorities as a district and within our school success plans and within our departments. I think the most immediate next step from here is about rolling out the policy to make sure everybody understands its intention and what it's calling on all of us to do. That would happen both at the staff level, but I think also students, like I'd mentioned, were really explicit in asking to make sure that we're thoughtful and creative about the ways in which we roll this out to students and make sure they understand what it's about as well. So I imagine us doing some summer work to figure out what that would look like. Barrett and I have already talked about trying to hire student interns to take what's sort of a dry document and turn it into something accessible and creative and interesting. I think Burke sparked the concept of, what are they called? Not tweet. Thank you, Barrett. I'm not a big social media person.
What was it? I missed it.
TikTok videos.
TikTok. That's where I went, but I didn't know that's what. Oh, nice.
Like, is that a tweet? What is that? Anyway,
Okay.
So those would be immediate next steps.
Okay. Well, thank you. That did put together some of what I was thinking about, sort of related to what Mr. Rodriguez was saying. Like we have the urgency piece, but then also like somewhat dry for some people. You know, like having the really clear and spelled out policy. How does that transform into something that students, staff can connect to, and of course have the why, and why is this important, and so that helps me with picturing that piece. I think the other part I just wanted to ask, I was just curious, like in my understanding of how like the harassment policy is going to implement. I was thinking about like the ombudsman role. I was just thinking about like, is there potential to have like in our buildings, are there people just like these cohorts that have been like, are there people in our buildings that are really like the experts about understanding this policy? So I guess I'm just trying to think, because each culture and each building is so different, right? And like the expertise or people comfort with even just the language of what equity is, right? I feel like there's such a range of, and then just seeing in our community what's happening with co-opting language. So I guess I'm just throwing that out there too, like just feeling like what are ways that we can have real concrete roles that people have in our buildings as we're looking at this real change of culture, expectation throughout our district that we're changing a culture. So I guess that's just another thought.
I think that certainly exists to some degree through the equity leaders cohort, and that's something that we're continually trying to build capacity around. And I think next year there's some kind of additional moves we can make related to that. And I think that the kind of template of the rollout of the harassment discrimination policy is a good one to kind of think through of like how this actually works. Like, how do we systemically start to get people focused on a policy? And just, I personally see my work as very central to this policy, and that this would be something I would be working very closely on moving forward. I think that would become really central to my work. And then, obviously in collaboration with other administrators and central leadership. And
I would just add, and Erin, I don't know if you want to chime in, but in addition to our equity leaders, I mean, this is and continues to be a deep focus with our admin team, because it's critical that our administrators are grounded in this and have an understanding and awareness of how to lead with this orientation. And anyway, so I don't know if Erin, you wanted to say anything else about that, but.
No, just, naming that, it becomes, and I think as I, kind of hold the, the purpose of the policy, it's like the work of the organization. It's not like we need to keep adding on extra layers in terms of accountability, but the core people, starting with us, right? And then working down through the organization, hold responsibility for advancing the equity work. And if we can't get through that, then we're not ultimately going to get anywhere. I don't, all of those assets in terms of the equity leaders, right, are all resources there, but the core leaders in the organization principally, the work begins there. And if we can't, if we are not leading from that space, and I feel like Roberto's, kind of notion in this regard in terms of the urgency, then, we can add whatever additional kinds of things, but we're just going to be internally in conflict. And so, I think this clarity of purpose of who we are as an organization and the responsibility we hold first and foremost at this level, and then with our school building leaders holding that and building their capacity to drive it forward with their school communities is, kind of the investment and the accountability.
Thank you, Ms. Russell-Better. Are you set with your questions? Okay, excellent. Ms. Bondo.
Yeah, I just had a few comments, and I think Ms. Thompson just answered most of what I had in my mind. Is that also when I was working with the team, that when I was looking on my own perspective, I was looking mostly the success of the policy in the future years to come is about everything is more located on the professional development. And then it was also my concern about how we shifted the mindset of the leaders of the schools and teachers, because they're the one going to be on the front line to make sure then they really understand about the value of the equity, how we see everything to the lens of equity. So that means we're changing culture. We try to improve really something that we never had before. I mean, how we try to make the difference between equality and equity versus equity. So this is exactly then some of the teachers, educators, they really want to promote equity, but they just didn't know the way to do it. So I think that professional development is going to be the key major. And I just go a little bit aligning what Mr. Roberto just mentioned about. It's about the urgency and also the value behind some of how we going to present and who we going to hold accountable about the implementation. So that's something that we need to watch for the future. And I think the most important key major that I was really see that is that are we involving the teachers, educators, and administrators to make sure then the implementation is really aligning with our Portland promise, and make sure then that's exactly when we're giving the student a platform to speak about the experience. That's why we're learning about the success of the failure of our policy in the year future. And I think the feedback from for most of the students is going to be the key major to measure the success of our policy coming up. Yes.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bondo. Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I wanted to just be really clear that I am very enthusiastic about this policy, and my comments earlier with the urgency and the frustration of this work, in essence, is why I'm so excited about this policy. And I think that frustration is what, maybe not my frustration, but the frustration with this work is what gets us to create a policy like this, right? Because after the Portland Promise equity goal, we realized, as we've said multiple times tonight, that we were lacking that really deep understanding of what equity is. And here we are trying to bridge that. So that's part of the evolution that I was mentioning before. Again, my sense of urgency, I think, is something that that is shared by many. I probably express it probably not as cleanly or as eloquently as could be. I think it comes with layers of anger and other emotions. And I think that, I don't want to take away from anyone's contribution to this policy. So I definitely wanted to clear that up. The last thing that I'll say is that I'm going to enthusiastically vote in support of this policy in our next meeting. And as I'll continue with my service here in Portland Public Schools, will continue to support all the work that's attached to this policy and all the work that we all believe needs to happen as a result of this policy. So I don't want to take away from that. So I wanted to clarify that before we left tonight. Thank you.
Can I just say something? First of all, thank you, Chair, Mr. Rodriguez. know that to be true, and have always respected your and feel very much supported by your commitment to this work. I led into this by talking about the 3 places where the board is able to affect change. And, the first is by hiring the superintendent. The second, by making budget decisions. And the third, through policy. So I didn't do that randomly or just as a lesson and reminder. It's, all 3 of those things together are how you are helping to move this work forward. And this policy is a critical piece to be able to advance the equity work that we're all committed to. And so, those other policy levers, the budget that is out for community approval next week, is a very clear step in that direction. And I think I don't need to go through all of the specific pieces in that budget that help to advance the equity work. And this policy is ultimately about, and Aaron mentioned it in his comments, about holding us accountable. It's ultimately about holding me accountable for moving this work forward. And so this policy gives you the tools to hold the superintendent, and it gives me the tools to hold the district accountable for advancing the equity work that is addressed in this policy. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands where the board's span of control sits and how this is a critical piece of that, because we have recognized, maybe late, but that something like this was necessary to be able to help us move that work at a more, at a more deliberate speed.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent, for articulating that. Again, articulating the levers that the board has and focusing us on that. I really appreciate that. Mr. Rodriguez, are you set for now?
Yeah, for now. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you for your comments. I personally did not think your follow-up comments were at all needed, but appreciated for sure. Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question and a comment. My question, building off of what Member Rodriguez brought up earlier in terms of the pacing, because I think while this policy, which I fully support and have been excited for its development since last March and every version I've seen since then, kind of sets a new baseline and safeguards us from some of the things that we might have fallen into previously. I'm looking at the section on compliance and the first one, goal setting. Can anybody speak to who's going to determine if the goals set are good enough, or if they have fallen prey to pacing for privilege or other liabilities that we might face in trying to enact this policy?
I mean, I think that we set goals at the district level that inform the goals the school set at the school level and the department set at their level. And so you would have visibility into the aggregate district level goals that guide the goal setting throughout the organization. And so I think the superintendent holds his team accountable for developing goals that fit with this. You hold him accountable. That's how I would perceive that, but Javier, certainly jump in if you.
I think that's right. I mean, the straightforward answer is you will make that judgment as you evaluate my performance.
Okay. I look forward to those conversations, and I look forward to your continued good performance, Superintendent. My comment is particularly made light by the cowardly signs that were put out this weekend, and the kind of thread of nativist BS that comes through in the comments that come alongside those, as well as Facebook threads and other, I would say, conversations that aren't brave enough to come here into the public, that often target many of my colleagues, including the superintendent, is I want it to be known as a descendant of somebody that walked off the Mayflower, as the descendant of somebody that has generations of family that have lived in Portland in the 1700s and the 1800s and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that I fully support this, and that I acknowledge that I'm not even from here, that I am a citizen of a country that's founded on the genocide of one people and the enslavement of another that's yet to reconcile that living legacy and the ongoing harms that it perpetuates. And so for anybody that's going to say that they look forward to having somebody that's from Portland, I'm from Portland. I'm from here as much as anybody else that has a skin tone like me is from here and that isn't from an indigenous nation. And this is the right policy for our schools at this time. And I appreciate everybody's contributions to it.
Thank you, Mr. Burke. I have a number of questions, and they're more specific questions than maybe we've gotten into so far. So if you will indulge me, I think this document is incredibly impressive and a terrific piece of work. I just have, like, looking at the details, I have some questions I want to get into. But just starting off, I'm wondering, do we know if there are other districts that have equity policies like this?
Yes, we studied other examples from other cities in the initial stage of our development. And there was one other policy from a Maine district that we looked at, that we got access to through a collaborative group that's been hosted by USM. Yeah.
Great, thank you. My first question that gets more into the specifics is under staff and capacity building. And under professional development, we say all PPS staff are expected to participate in professional development opportunities related to equity, and that expectation is repeated later on in that initial paragraph. And I'm wondering why not use the word required rather than expected?
And others jump in, but I think there was no moment where we debated the distinction between required and expected. So I think for those of us that drafted it, it means one and the same, but I think that language could be shifted. I will share that at one point, the policy included language about requiring attendance be taken and things like that. We removed that detail because that's, to the points we'd made earlier, it started to get beyond the realm of policy and into practice and action. But anyway, so that there was this desire to make it very, very clear that people need to go to the PD, but those two words were not words that I recall us discussing as options, and so it could be required.
I'll just say I work for a nonprofit organization, and I have an expectation to attend weekly all staff meetings, but it conflicts with my kids' school schedule during COVID, and so I miss most of them, and it's fine. So I think there's a real difference between an expectation and because I think staff can opt out, and that's okay, or being required to it as a part of your job. So I'll just offer that up. And then under B, staff evaluation, this is kind of a similar comment, which is this staff evaluation paragraph seems like it could be more direct with the second sentence, including something that reflects like staff evaluations will include how they're bringing an equity lens to their work. So just a clear, establishing that we're going to evaluate our staff based on whether they're bringing an equity lens and or not, and how, and how that they can continue to work to develop that equity lens. So I guess that's a question of, did we consider a more direct kind of accountability for our staff in that case, where we're going to evaluate every staff member when we do our evaluations? It's going to include their application of an equity lens.
That's what's intended by this language. And so, I hear your feedback in that, but when we say the tools and processes should incorporate opportunities and reflection and feedback on the degree to which staff utilize an equity lens in their work and the impact on outcomes as it pertains to addressing gaps and inequities, this is specifically there to name that part of staff evaluation will include this equity lens and accountability.
And that's work that is currently happening to include equity in the teacher evaluation system.
Yeah, I mean, it's nascent work. There was a team that integrated equity literacy across the domains of our TVAL system, and there's next steps to further do that, plus bring that to other evaluations, like our principal evaluation, our central office staff evaluation. So this letter here is general. It's not specific to like teacher evaluation because it's trying to speak to all staff, and that this is an expectation for evaluation of all staff.
But do we need to be more explicit? Because I just worry that it can, if we're not more explicit, it can be read differently. So one building leader could choose not to evaluate staff based on their application of an equity lens.
I mean, I think that in partly this is where we went in the work group, is like, at what point are we defining kind of expectations and follow? But I mean, we could potentially strengthen the second sentence, but again, it is saying very specifically the tools and processes should incorporate this feedback and reflection around an equity lens and opportunity gaps. And so it's not saying you might consider having, like, it's saying the tools and processes will do that. I think one language it says should incorporate, that, to your earlier point about require, could potentially be strengthened in terms of something like
just saying
will incorporate, something like that.
Or must incorporate, yeah. So just taking away that wiggle room, and having what we're laying out in this policy be as clear as possible, including to people who are reading it from different perspectives. Then I'm moving forward to implementation strategies, and under resource allocation, I have a couple of questions, and one is under the first, under the I, around the budget. And I wonder here if we want to, again, make this stronger and more about the budget centering on equity. Because as I read this, it seemed like the requirement is that the superintendent build a budget that clearly articulates how it advances equity, but it doesn't say that it centers equity. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And yeah.
I mean, Javier, I don't know if you want to share any of your thoughts on that, because I know you've reflected on that accountability to you in terms of budget building. I do hear your point, Ms. Figdor, in terms of, it doesn't say center. It says that it has to be articulated in the context of that.
I really don't have anything to add. I mean, I think that, I get the language piece, but to me, that's all it really is. Because I don't know. 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 I exactly what centering means, other than, making it a prominent part of what we're trying to do as a district. And I think that, so I'm open to the language change, but I don't think I would behave any differently as a result of it saying centering versus what it says now.
I guess what I'm thinking is, it's just beyond our current environment too. If we have a different superintendent, we have a different board, this creates accountability, this creates opportunities for the board, for instance, in using a lever more strongly to ensure that equity is central to our budget and to what we're trying to do. So, just thinking again outside our current context, I want to make sure that this policy is as strong as possible as the district's work evolves.
Again, I don't think, I understand it, and I don't have a problem with changes in the language. This policy does call for it being reassessed on an ongoing basis annually, I believe. So it's something that we can revisit and see if we aren't doing it, well enough, and if language changes would help with that. Okay.
And then my next question, and I promise I just have one more after this, so thank you again for indulging me. But in the next section, I'm wondering, that says that that any school-based activity or opportunity for students needs to be made available for all students and must not require a financial burden beyond what a family can afford. And I'm wondering if and then there's some further detailing of that. I'm wondering if we know what the practical implications will be of this section of the policy, and if we have a plan in place to manage those.
I'll share a couple of thoughts, but Javier and Barrett and others, you can jump in. I think it's a good question. We talked about this. There's that caveat about the burden put on families, except for when required by state and federal law for things like, bring reduced lunch or something like that. But we have thought about some potential implications, but I would not say that we've done a thorough analysis of all the implications. Examples of things that have surfaced previously and we're already doing something about are things like the AP test. We've added money to our budget to make sure that students don't have to pay for the AP test if that's a barrier for them. But then there's other examples where we haven't addressed it and it's not reflected in our budget. And I think the one that came up is school pictures. So if we are offering school pictures and many families can't afford it, does that mean we either don't offer school pictures or we're paying for the school pictures? I think that's a good concrete example of one that, that would be a big add to the budget, or a big shift to say nobody gets the pictures. So I guess my answer is we've considered there will be implications, some of which I think would be pretty difficult for us, but I can't say we've completely looked through all of those kinds of implications. I don't know, Javier, if you'd want to add to that or say anything different.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's, this is where the rubber meets the road in the implementation of this policy, is that will force us into conversations like, can we have pictures, since we don't have the money for everybody who may not be able to afford it to be able to get them for free. So, or, do we offer that camping trip to the White Mountains if, some people can't afford it?
And I'm wondering in particular about sports and other co-curriculars, for instance, and sometimes when the costs aren't maybe as explicit, like transportation to different sports events, like even just around Portland, for instance.
We try for most of those to provide, but I can't tell you in a universal way that there are not, occasions that students do not participate in something because they know it's going to be challenging to be able to get there and so on. So.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question is around data utilization. The last point there, the V, and it says the district schools and departments will carry out periodic equity audits. I'm wondering if we want to specify a timeline there with a minimum of, at least twice a year or something of that sort.
What I can say, my recommendation would be not to, but that's just my perspective. We did talk, that's actually something we did talk about, and again, felt on that edge of, is this policy or is this sort of getting more drilled into our annual goal setting? I think that it's not like there's like a singular routine equity audit that we would then routinize. It's a process that we've applied as there's been a need. So you were familiar, we did the equity audit of policies, right? Where we sent them out to see and they gave us feedback. We did an equity audit that was around discipline data as it pertained to a goal that we had focused there. So I think we talked about that and removed language that was moving in the direction of what you described, because we didn't want to artificially create all these kinds of requirements that weren't necessarily authentic and aligned with whatever the annual priorities and goals were. So it's a process and a tool. And I think when we articulate goals and things like that, we'll ask ourselves, you'll ask the superintendent, where does the equity audit process fit into that? But we made a decision not to name some sort of number and frequency because it's not really how they played out in terms of when they've been most valuable to us.
Okay, great. Thank you for that explanation. And that's it for my questions. I just do want to lift up there are so many parts of this policy that, those are specific questions I had to make the policy, from my perspective, as strong and as possible, and to make sure that it continues to stay relevant long into the future. There were so many pieces that I could have talked about that, like saying to me that I thought were so strong and good, like just putting under, I'll just mention one, under engagement and collaboration, that having systems and structure in place to uplift and amplify student voice as it pertains to decision-making and accountability related to this policy. I really loved that piece. So I just want to, and then in terms of the questions I raised, I'm happy to pass the policy as you brought it to us. Just wanted to raise those and fully appreciate the work and collaboration and process that went into this, but I did want to just raise those questions. And so that is it. I do think that Ms. Russell-Better might have had a question as well. Or do you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Chair. Forgive my newbie school board member question, but I think, Superintendent, when you were mentioning, which was helpful, just the reminder of our role in, hiring superintendent, the budget piece and the policy piece, I'm just trying to wrap my head around, and we've just been talking about it, but just for me to clarify that in the implementation piece, so in the piece of the policy we've been looking at that talks about the data, like the goal setting, annual review and audit, would those be, so then am I right in the assumption that in part of our role, because it doesn't say specifically in there, but would those be shared with the board regularly? And then that's the place that then we have also the role and feedback about it, because I understand that the implementation piece isn't directly our role. But I'm trying to understand if it's in keeping you accountable, Superintendent, is it then that with that data and information, we're looking at that and then giving feedback about whether the policy is in fact doing what it's supposed to do? Does that make sense, my question?
Yes, I think the answer is yes.
Okay, so that is in getting the data. So am I right Malia, and those pieces, the data that would be collected would somehow regularly be, shared with the board to then give feedback. That's like a regular process.
Yeah, I mean, I think the policy articulates a minimal expectation of annual reporting. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, any last questions from the board? So we will consider this policy on second read, meaning, of course, that we will discuss, have a further opportunity for questions, discuss it, hear public comment, and vote on it at our next meeting on the 15th. I think if, this is a really significant policy, I think that if questions arise for any board members before the next board meeting, it would be best to air those questions, or if you have any changes you wanted to be made to air those prior to the meeting, so we're fully aware of them and aren't surprised by anything. And I just want to thank the tremendous work that has gone into crafting this policy. I'm really blown away by how thorough it is, and the framework that it gives to so much of what we're trying to do. So thank you to all, and I want to hand it back to Malia for any, and the superintendent for any closing thoughts.
I don't have anything to say other than thank you. Thank you to Member Bondo, to Member Burke, and Member Rodriguez for their leadership on the curriculum committee, to Barrett for everything he did to make this happen and manage the work groups, the students, the partnerships, and then to the work group team that we named when we started this conversation. People gave such insightful, authentic feedback. I feel like everybody came to this with their whole heads and hearts on. And so I'm just deeply grateful for that collaborative, collective effort that has led to what I think is a really important policy for the district, that will hold us accountable for some very transformational work. So I feel very honored to have been a part of that process so far. It's just beginning.
And I would just like to add a special thank you to Malia, because Malia was the person who came forward to me and said, we don't have an equity policy. We have, lots of disparate pieces of work that are related to equity, but we don't have an equity policy, and brought the examples of the school districts that were actually leading with a policy. So the Baltimore and, just outside of Portland, Oregon, I can't think of what the name of the district is. But, actually using those examples to kick off this work. So thank you, Malia, for, becoming aware of that and bringing it to all of us, and, seeing where we are today. It's just remarkable. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, that concludes our workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, for your great work tonight, and have a good night. And we'll see you on the 15th.